Muswell Hill remains a relatively quiet and salubrious suburb of North London. Ironically, it was developed at the beginning of the 20th century, when a murder took place in the vicinity, and city sightseers taking the long tram ride to the scene were struck by the charm of the surrounding woods and fields. 80 years on, a later generation of sightseers could be found outside 23 Cranley Gardens, one of the many streets of houses that had sprung up in the area. The resonance with the earlier pilgrimages was both uncanny and depressing. JLT was a bitterly cold day on February 3, 1983, when the tenants of a house which had been converted into apartments first complained of a blockage in the drainage system. 5 days later, when an engineer came to inspect the drains, he found the inspection pit deep in stinking, rotting flesh. As it was late, he decided not to report to his employers until the next morning. When he returned, he found that most of the flesh had disappeared. However, some bones and a small piece of flesh had lodged in a pipe, so he contacted the police. 6. One of the ground floor tenants told them that she had heard quiet footsteps repeatedly passing her door in the night, seemingly coming from the top apartment. It was there that Dennis Nilsen, a polite, bespectacled 37-year-old civil servant, lived alone. Learning from the police laboratory within hours that the bones and fragment of flesh were human, detectives were waiting for Nilsen when he returned home from work. Chief Inspector Peter J. greeted him. "Good evening, Mr. Nilsen. I've come to talk to you about your drains." When told of the grisly discovery, Nilsen replied calmly, "Good grief, how awful." The conversation then took a startlingly dramatic turn. "Don't mess around. Where's the rest of the body?" "In 2 plastic bags in the wardrobe. I'll show you." Taken to the police station, Nilsen was asked, "Are we talking about 1 body or 2? Nilsen responded, 15 or 16 since 1978, 3 at Cranley Gardens and about 13 at my previous address. This was a total that made him, at that time, Britain's most prolific serial killer. Over the next 2 weeks, he provided gruesome details of his crimes. Self-confessed homosexual, Nilsen was desperately lonely after leaving the army and settling in Cricklewood, northwest London. Working at an official employment bureau, a job centre in central London, he constantly came in contact with equally lonely dropouts and would buy them rounds of drinks before taking them to his apartment for companionship. Then, on December 30th, 1978, after a solitary Christmas, he picked up a youthful Irish manual laborer in a local pub called the Cricklewood Arms and became a killer for the first time. Waking in bed with the young man, he seized a necktie impulsively and strangled his sleeping victim. To make doubly sure, he then held the man's head in a bucket of water for some minutes. Then began the extraordinary ritual that was to be repeated frequently in the next few years and for which Nilsen was eventually to be described as killing for company. He placed the corpse in the bathtub and carefully washed it. After drying it, he put it in his bed. Next day, he hid it beneath the floorboards in his room, but a week later he brought it out again and gave it another bath. After this, the corpse remained under the floor for 8 months, until August 1979, when Nilsen cremated it in a bonfire. Sometime later in 1979, he picked up a student cook from Hong Kong, Andrew Ho, and attempted to strangle him, but the intended victim escaped. Ho reported the assault to the police, but they dismissed the incident after the student refused to prosecute. The second killing came on December 3, 1979, after Nilsen got into a lunchtime conversation with 19-year-old Canadian Kenneth Ockenden. Kenneth was due to fly home for Christmas with his family the next day, but was persuaded to go home with Nilsen to Cricklewood. After a meal and many drinks, he was strangled. Nilsen bathed him, slept with the body beside him, and then hid it under the floorboards. Over the next 2 weeks, he took up the corpse several times, sitting with it to watch TV shows. 5 months passed until, in May 1980, Martin Duffy, 16, became the third victim. A few days later, 27-year-old Billy Sutherland joined Duffy under the floorboards. As for his next 7 victims, Nilsen was infuriatingly vague. One was from the Philippines or Thailand. One was yet another young Irish worker in London. The next a starving hippie type. The fourth he could hardly remember. 2 were young Scotsmen that he had picked up. And the 11th victim was a tattooed skinhead. The police were unable to make any identification of these victims from such unhelpful descriptions. On November 10, 1980, 26-year-old Douglas Stewart had a narrow escape. After drinking with Nilsen in the West End of London, he agreed to return to Cricklewood, where he fell asleep in a chair. Waking, he found that his ankles were tied and Nilsen was trying to strangle him with a necktie. There was a struggle and Stewart broke free, escaping from the house to call the police. They, however, decided that the incident was a domestic disagreement between 2 homosexuals and took no further action. There were no more incidents, at least as far as Nilsen confessed, until September 17, 1981. He found Malcolm Barlow, 24, slumped in a drug-induced state close by his home as he left for work and sent him to hospital. On his return, he found Barlow once more at this door, invited him in, and strangled him. The following month, Nilsen was given notice by his landlord with the offer of an alternative apartment in Cranley Gardens. By the end of the previous year, he had already disposed of some of his victims' decomposing bodies in a second bonfire, and now he consigned the rest to the flames. After his arrest, he described to the police how he first cut off the hands and feet, washed and dried them, and stored them in plastic bags. Then he removed all the major internal organs and tipped them into a narrow space between the yard fence and a wall, where they were soon consumed by rats, cats, and foxes. The arms and legs were cut into pieces, and the torso bisected. These were also put into bags, and finally burned. He laid old motor tires on the bonfire so that the smell of burning rubber covered the smell of roasting flesh. Once settled in Cranley Gardens, Nilsen continued his cruising for likely victims. His first 2 attempts on 25-year-old student Paul Nobbs and on a drag artist failed. For reasons that Nilsen himself could not explain, he gave up while trying to suffocate them. Oddly, neither of them approached the police until after the news of Nilsen's arrest. The first murder in Cranley Gardens was that of John Howlett, well known in the West End as John the Guardsman. When Nilsen attempted to strangle him with an upholstery strap, Howlett put up a fierce fight and was overcome only when Nilsen held his head
هل تشعر بالملل؟
underwater in the bathtub for 5 minutes. In the top-floor apartment, there was no convenient space under the floorboards to hide the remains. So after keeping the body in a closet for several days, Nilsen cut it into tiny pieces with a kitchen knife and flushed them down the lavatory. The head, hands, feet, and ribs were boiled in a large pan on the kitchen stove in order to remove the flesh, and the larger bones were packed into a crate where they remained until the police discovered them nearly a year later. Nilsen treated the corpse of his next victim, drunken drifter Graham Allen, in the same way. After some time, his final killing took place on January 26, 1983. Steve Sinclair was a 20-year-old drug addict. Nilsen picked him up, strangled him with a non-necktie, and dressed the body in his own clothes, keeping it for several days before dismembering it. I put the head in a pot, popped the lid on, and lit the stove. Later, I listened to music and had a good drink, also watching some TV as the head was simmering. It was Allen's remains that blocked the drains and led to the gruesome discovery and Nilsen's confession. Nilsen stood trial on October 24, 1983, charged with the murder of 6 men: Ockenden, Duffy, Sutherland, Barlow, Howlett, and Sinclair, and the attempted murder of Douglas Stewart and Paul Nobbs. Despite his detailed confession, which was given in evidence in court, he pleaded not guilty to all counts. Psychologists and counsel argued over his cold, remorseless nature and whether or not he was insane. A plea of diminished responsibility was rejected, however, and Nilsen was finally found guilty on November 4th by a jury majority of 10-2. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 25 years. As one commentator on the case wrote, "Most people like someone to come home to, and so did Dennis Nilsen. He just preferred them to be dead."